I'm only writing this down because my lawyer said I should have a record of everything in case he tries to come back. I haven't told my family the full details because I don't want them to worry, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. If something happens to me, at least this will be somewhere on a server. I moved into the place on 4th Street back in February because the rent was almost $400 cheaper than anything else in that neighborhood. It was a classic brownstone with high ceilings and old creaky wooden floors that looked great in the photos, but were a nightmare for noise. I'm a freelance graphic designer, so I spend about 90% of my life tucked away inside my home office, and at first, the quiet felt like a blessing. There were only 4 units in the building, and the landlord told me the other tenants were mostly older people who kept to themselves. My unit was 3A, a 3rd-floor walk-up that shared a small, dimly lit landing with Unit 3B. The guy living across from me was named Mr. Henderson, or at least that's what the nameplate on his door said in faded gold letters. He looked to be in his late 70s, always wearing the same heavy wool cardigan even when the radiator was hissing with heat. The first time we met, I was hauling a box of kitchen supplies up the stairs, and he was just standing there in his doorway, watching me, silent, still, like a shadow that had learned to breathe. He didn't offer to help or even say hello. He just stared until I managed to get my key in the lock and slip inside. It started about 2 weeks after I settled in, right around the time I finished setting up my dual monitor workstation in the 2nd bedroom. I'd be sitting there late at night, working on a branding project, and I'd hear a faint scuffing sound coming from the hallway. It wasn't the sound of someone walking past or checking their mail, but a slow, deliberate movement right outside my door. The first few times I ignored it, figuring the old floorboards were just settling or maybe a neighbor was fumbling with their keys. But then it became a pattern that happened every single night at exactly 11 o'clock. One night, I got fed up with the distraction and decided to look through the peephole to see if it was a stray cat or something. I moved as quietly as I could, barely breathing, and pressed my eye against the small glass lens. I didn't see a cat, and I didn't see an empty hallway. What I saw was the back of a head, sparse gray hair combed over a pale scalp, leaning forward at a sharp angle. Mr. Henderson was standing there, his body completely still, with his left ear pressed firmly against the wood of my door. My heart was beating very fast. I stood still for 10 minutes, just listening to the normal sounds of my office, the hum of my computer fan, and the occasional click of my mouse. I wanted to speak to him about it, but I could not move because of how strange it felt. Eventually, he stood up straight, turned around, and walked back into his apartment without making a single sound. I stayed awake until sunrise that morning, looking at the door and wondering what he was hoping to hear. A few days later, I was cleaning the bedroom because the dust in that old building was starting to trigger my allergies. I moved the bed away from the wall to vacuum the baseboards, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. There were 3 tiny, perfectly circular holes drilled into the wood, just above the floor level. They were so small, I almost missed them, maybe the width of a toothpick, but they were clean and clearly intentional. I knelt down and tried to look through one, but it was dark on the other side, though I could smell a faint, musty odor. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and shone it directly into the middle hole to see how deep it went. The beam drifted forward, soft and steady, but it never touched a wall or any insulation. It just kept traveling into a hollow space I didn't know existed. And in that quiet moment, I realized these holes weren't random at all. They were angled upward, pointed with careful intent at the exact spot where my head rests on the pillow every night. It wasn't a simple construction flaw, and it wasn't a channel for cables. Someone had spent a long, patient stretch of time measuring the height of my mattress, making sure they had a clear line of sight. I felt sick, honestly, like I wanted to throw up right there on the rug. And I told myself it was probably the previous tenant or some weird quirk of the building's history, but I knew I was lying to myself. I took some duct tape and covered the holes, then pushed a heavy dresser in front of that section of the wall. I thought that would be enough to make me feel safe, but it only made me more aware of every creak and groan the building made. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room with all the lights on, but the feeling of being watched never went away. The following Monday, I went down to the lobby to grab my mail, expecting the usual bills and junk flyers. Tucked between a credit card offer and a utility bill was a plain white envelope with no return address or stamp. My name was written on the front in shaky, cramped handwriting that looked like it had been done with a dying ballpoint pen. I opened it while standing by the mailboxes, thinking it might be a note from the landlord about the building's plumbing. Instead, 3 Polaroid photos slid out and hit the floor, landing face up on the tile. I picked them up, and for a moment, everything inside me just stalled. I couldn't even make sense of what I was seeing. The photos were grainy, washed in too much light, but the subject, there was no mistaking it. It was me, fast asleep on the couch I'd been using as a bed, wrapped in my blue fleece blanket. And the angle was impossible. It looked as though the camera had been hovering directly above me, staring straight down from the ceiling itself. I lifted my eyes to the lobby ceiling, then ran. I ran as fast as my legs would move, back up the stairs, slamming every latch on my door until each one clicked shut. I spent the next hour sitting on the floor of my kitchen, the only room without a shared wall, holding a knife and looking at the ceiling. I kept looking for a camera or a hidden vent, but there was nothing but peeling white paint and the old light fixture. The realization that someone had been inside my apartment while I was unconscious made the air feel heavy and hard to breathe. I did not call the police right away, which I know sounds silly now, but I was in total shock and kept trying to think of a reason for it as a joke by a friend. I eventually convinced myself to stay, thinking that if I just made the door stronger, I would be fine until I could find a new place. I went out to the hardware store that evening and bought the heaviest deadbolt they had, along with a security bar that wedges under the handle. When I got home, I noticed the landing smelled strange, like a mix of rotting flowers and machine grease. I ignored it and got to work, trying to focus on the mechanical task of drilling into the door frame to stay calm. When I went to test the existing deadbolt before installing the new one, the key wouldn't turn at all. I pulled the key out and looked at it, only to find it was covered in a thick, yellowish fluid that felt like heavy motor oil. I touched the keyhole, and my finger came away dripping with the same substance, which had a sickly sweet smell that made my skin crawl. Someone hadn't just jammed the lock, they had lubricated the internal mechanism from the inside of the apartment so the bolt would slide back silently. I realized then that my safe door was essentially useless if someone had a master key and could now move the hardware without making a single click. I felt a cold wave of sweat break out across my neck as I realized the oil was still wet, meaning someone had been at my door only minutes before I arrived. I didn't even bother with the tools. I just threw a few things into a duffel bag and decided I was going to a hotel. Before I left, I grabbed my laptop from the office desk because I couldn't afford to lose my work files if the place got robbed. As I went to shut it down, I noticed the small green LED light next to the webcam was flickering faintly, even though I didn't have any video apps open. I've always been a bit tech-savvy, so I opened the system's activity monitor to see what was triggering the hardware. My heart stopped when I saw a background process I didn't recognize, something titled system_host_mirror that was consuming a massive amount of data. I traced the outgoing connection and found it was streaming a live feed to a local IP address within the building's internal network. I looked at the files on the computer. The files showed that a camera had been turned on each night for 3 months, from around midnight to 6 in the morning. It was also noted that the computer was accessed even when it was closed and not connected to power. A change in the system allowed it to be used as a device to observe me while I was asleep. I closed the computer and put it away, feeling that my personal space had been invaded. As I was frantically packing, I heard a rhythmic, wet thudding sound coming from the wall I shared with the empty hallway. It sounded like someone was hitting the drywall with a damp sponge over and over in a slow and steady beat. I stopped moving, holding my breath, and noticed that the sound was coming from the exact spot where I had taped over those tiny drill holes. The dresser I had pushed in front of the wall began to vibrate almost imperceptibly, as if something on the other side was trying to push through. I didn't wait to see what it was. I just grabbed my bag and bolted out the door, nearly tripping over my own feet in the hallway. I ran out of the apartment and didn't stop running until I reached the street, where the cold air finally hit my lungs. I checked into a cheap motel 3 towns over, using a fake name because I was convinced I was being followed. I spent the night sitting in a chair facing the door, watching the gap at the bottom for any signs of movement. Around 3:00 a.m., I got a notification on my phone that my smart thermostat back at the apartment had been manually adjusted to 85 degrees. I watched the app in real time as someone went through every room, turning on the smart lights and then turning them off again, one by one. I sat there in the dark motel room, watching my phone screen as the bedroom light in my apartment clicked on and stayed on for 20 minutes. I could almost imagine the person standing there in the heat, looking at the empty bed and the dresser I'd moved. The app showed the front door lock being engaged and disengaged repeatedly, like a child playing with a new toy. It was a digital taunt, a way of telling me that they still had control over my space even if I wasn't there. I eventually had to turn the phone off because seeing the icons flicker was making me lose my mind. The next morning, I called the landlord and demanded he meet me at the property with the police. He sounded confused and a bit annoyed, claiming he was out of state and wouldn't be back for a few days. I told him if he didn't give me the contact information for the tenant in 3B immediately, I was going to sue him for every cent he had. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that makes your hair stand on end. He finally told me that Unit 3B had been empty for over 2 years because of a legal dispute with the previous estate. There was no Mr. Henderson, and there hadn't been a legal occupant in that unit since before I even moved into the city. The landlord's words felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to swallow. If 3B was empty, then the man I had seen, the one who had spent hours listening to my life through a sheet of drywall, wasn't a neighbor at all. He was a squatter, or something worse, who had been living parallel to me in total silence for months. I told the landlord to call the police and meet me there in an hour, but I didn't wait for him to agree before I hung up. I drove back to the brownstone with a sense of dread that made my hands go numb against the steering wheel. When I arrived, 2 security guards were waiting by the entrance, drinking coffee from paper cups. I led them upstairs, hearing the floorboards creak under our weight, each sound drifting through the quiet like a warning. The landing was still, but the same faint odor was stronger now, hanging in the air as if it had been waiting for us. I used my key to open my door, then let the guards enter first. One of them moved through the rooms, checking each corner, while the other stayed with me, asking questions about the pictures and the computer records, his voice low, careful, as though the walls might be listening. They found the apartment as I had left it, with one disturbing difference. The dresser I had pushed tight against the bedroom wall now lay crooked on the floor, scraped, splintered, as if something had forced it aside. And behind it, the wall itself had been torn open. Where small holes once were, a whole section was gone, revealing a dark, narrow hollow beyond. An officer lifted his flashlight, its beam slipping into that hidden space quiet, cold, waiting. There, between the floor supports of the units, ran a cramped passage just wide enough for someone to slip through, and, clearly, someone had been using it. The officer climbed through the opening, his boots disappearing into the shadows, and for a few minutes the only sound was the muffled shuffling of his movements. When he came back out, his face was pale, and he looked like he wanted to wash his hands. He told me that the space between the walls was outfitted with a makeshift sleeping bag, dozens of empty water bottles, and a direct view into my bathroom. There was a small battery-powered monitor connected to a receiver that was still warm to the touch. Whoever had been living in the walls had only vacated the space moments before we arrived. We walked across the hall to Unit 3B, and the officers had to kick the door in since the landlord wasn't there with the key. The apartment was a tomb, filled with thick layers of dust and furniture covered in yellowing plastic sheets. It looked exactly like a place that had been abandoned for years until we reached the master bedroom. In the middle of the floor, there was a single, pristine chair facing the wall shared with my apartment. On the seat of the chair was a stack of my own mail, neatly sorted by date, and a small digital recorder that was currently in the on position. The official started the recording equipment. My voice was audible in the room, a recording of a phone call I had with my mother a few nights before. The audio was very clear, as if the microphone was close. Then the recording changed to the sound of me brushing my teeth. Next came the steady breathing of a person standing near the microphone. We listened quietly as the person on the recording said my full name. This was followed by an unusual chuckle, one that did not sound normal. The police did a full sweep of the building, checking the basement and the roof, but they found no sign of the man I knew as Mr. Henderson. They did find a back service entrance where the lock had been bypassed with the same sweet-smelling oil I found on my door. The forensic team arrived later that afternoon, but they couldn't find any fingerprints that didn't belong to me or the landlord. It was as if the man had lived there without ever touching a single hard surface with his bare skin. He was a ghost in the machine, a shadow that had learned the rhythm of my life better than I knew it myself. I moved out that same evening, leaving behind most of my furniture and anything else that felt tainted by his presence. I took a job in a different state and changed my phone number, but the psychological damage was already done. Every time I hear a floorboard creak in my new place, I find myself checking the baseboards for tiny circular holes. I keep my laptop in a drawer when I'm not using it, and I've taped over every single camera on every device I own. I thought moving 1,000 miles away would be enough to make me feel safe again, but I was wrong. A week ago, I received a notification from a new cloud storage account I didn't recognize, claiming I had shared memories to view. I opened the link on a library computer, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw a folder containing hundreds of audio files. They were all dated from the last 3 days, and the titles were the names of the rooms in my new apartment. The most recent file was time-stamped from just 20 minutes ago, and the thumbnail was a photo of the back of my head while I sat in the library. I haven't gone back to my new apartment since then, and I'm currently writing this from a bus station. I don't know where he is, and I don't know how he keeps finding me, but I know he's listening right now. I can feel the weight of his attention on me like a physical heat, and every stranger I pass looks like him in the corner of my eye. I'm going to keep moving until I run out of road, or until he finally decides to stop watching and start acting. If you're reading this, and you think your apartment is a little too quiet, check your walls, because someone might be waiting for you to fall asleep. That's everything I can remember for now, and I honestly don't want to think about it anymore. I'm heading to the next station, and I'm not looking back. Please just keep this safe in case I don't check in again.